Hey guys, today's video is on complex numbers. This is another part of getting you guys ready for the ACT. This should be review from first semester. So we're going to start from the beginning and go all the way. The only thing we're not talking about is division. It's not an ACT book, so we're not going to talk about it because I just want you to focus on what specifically the ACT wants you guys to focus on. Okay, if we are square rooting a negative, all you do is simplify the radical, which we've talked about recently. And then this negative just means we're going to have an I. So we're going to look at what that looks like. So first thing to do is simplify. You can actually break this up. Square root of -1 times the square root of 16. That way you can just focus on the number inside the radical. Square root of 16 is 4. Square root of -1 is I. So the answer to this one is 4I. You always put the number first and then I for the imaginary part. So let's look at this one. We have square root of 81 and the square root of -1. The square root of 81 is 9. Square root of -1 is I. Then it gets to be a little bit more complicated when they're not perfect squares. So we're still going to break them apart to make this easier. We have the square root of 45 times the square root of -1. So this we can put to the side, and we're going to focus on this 45. Thinking about what perfect square goes into 45, I know that 9 goes into it. So we're going to break this apart and do square root of 9 times the square root of 5. We know that square root of -1 is going to be I. Square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 5 just stays there. And then all I do is I take this imaginary number and I put it right there. So the imaginary numbers are sandwiched between your whole number and your radical. One more example. We have the square root of 200 times the square root of -1. I think what perfect square goes into 200? 100. 100 times 2 gives me 200. And we know the square root of -1 is I. Square root of 100 is 10. Square root of 2 stays that way. And then our I just gets sandwiched in between. So that's how you simplify radicals with a negative. So we're just combining what we've talked about fairly recently and then just adding that negative component. Now we're going to get into our powers of I. So if you think about it as a clock, it helps a little bit. So we're going to do powers of I. So all of these, I'm going to have I to the first, I to the second, I to the third, I to the fourth. And all this does is it keeps cycling down. So when I get to I to the fourth, I to the fifth will be the exact same as I to the first power. Talk about what that means. So for this example, so talking about this, I to the first power is I, because anything to the raise to the first power is itself. I squared, this is -1 times -1. So I squared, I have negative times a negative is a positive, and the square root of 1 is just 1. So this becomes a 1. I to the third power is going to be -I. I to the fourth power is -1. Okay, so when you're looking at the ACT and you see questions like this and some of the ones that you're going to see on the back side, it's helpful to just write this out. I know I have I to the first, second, third, fourth. I have I and 1, and directly across from those is going to be the negative. And then I think about this with money. 1/4 is 0.25. 2 quarters is 0.5. 3 is 0.75. And 4 quarters is $1. So my decimal is 0.0. Here's why this is important. Anytime you have I raised to a power, you take the power, in this case it's 13, and we're going to divide it by 4. Why? Because it's a cycle of 4. So 13 divided by 4 gives me a decimal. All I care about is this decimal is 0.25. So 0.25 on my little I clock is I. So this power all raises or all simplifies to I. Let's do the same thing for this 27. I do 27 divided by 4. My decimal, again, I don't care about the whole number. All I care about is what that decimal is, and it's 0.75, which my iClock tells me is negative I. For 54, divide by 4. Again, my decimal here is 0.5, so I know it's 1. We'll look at the last one together. 72 divided by 4. My decimal, it's 18. It's a whole number, meaning it's 0.00. So I know it's going to be negative 1. So all you do is take that power divided by 4, and then this is the part that you kind of just have to memorize. So the trick is start with either the first, second, third, fourth. I know that anything raised to the first power is 1. You just need to know I to the first power is I. Any I squared is 1, and then across from those are just negative. You just change the sign and think about it in terms of quarters. So now let's look at adding and subtracting, and you're going to see these types of problems again when you guys do the practice on GoFormative. And they're directly straight from your ACT test prep book. So add and subtract, we treat I like we would a variable. So if, for instance, we had 2x plus 3 plus 5 minus 4x. All you do is drop your signs and combine like terms. And then all we do is combine like terms. We're going to do the same thing with I. We're going to treat it like a variable. So if it's adding, all I do is drop my parentheses. I can rewrite it. And now we just combine like terms. What goes with 3? 7. 7 plus 3 is 10. What goes with 2i? 6i, and 2 plus 6 is 8i. And that is it in simplified form. Now with the negative, all we do is distribute. So we're going to distribute this negative to everything behind in parentheses. So the negative goes to each piece. So this first parentheses drops just the way it is. 6 minus 5i. No changes. Then we're going to take this negative and distribute. So negative 1, negative 2i. Now you do the same thing we just did. We're going to combine like terms. 6 minus 1 is 5. Negative 5 and negative 2, they have the same sign, so you add 5 plus 2 is 7, so it's a negative 7i. Okay, I'll let you try that one and this one. We're going to move on to this one with all the exponents. So the first parentheses we write as is, 11i to the 4th plus 4i cubed. And then remember, we're going to have to distribute this negative. So it becomes a negative 2i to the 4th, and a negative times a negative makes it a positive 6i cubed. Combine like terms. So this part's still the same. 11i to the 4th goes with the negative 2i to the 4th, so 11 minus 2 is 9. And then 4i cubed goes with 6i cubed, which is 10i cubed. However, we need to simplify these. And we can do that using our clock. So when we do this, I know that I to the fourth is like 4/4. So it's 0.00, which is -1. So this is going to be 9 times all of this is just -1. Plus 10, all of I cubed is -I. And now we can simplify and make this a very simplified imaginary number. So 9 times -1 is -9. 10 times -I, positive and a negative makes it a -10I. And this is it. Something we haven't talked about yet, you always put your real and then your imaginary. So real is your whole number and imaginary is a part with I. So it's always written real, then imaginary. Okay, last thing we're going to look at is multiplication. Works the same way as it does with a variable. So you do it the exact same way you would with x. So for 14, we're going to distribute this -I to both pieces. Again, you treat I like a variable. -I times 3 is -3I. Negative and a positive makes this last one a negative. I times I is I squared. The only thing we cannot have is anything really higher than I. So what did we say I squared is? It's 1. So -3I minus this right here is just 1. So all that simplifies to 1. And then we just write it real, which is -1. And then the imaginary, which is -3I. This one we're going to distribute. Actually, let's do this one down here. We're going to distribute. Let's see. We have 3 goes to each piece back here. So 3 times -5 is -15. And then I also do it to the -9I. Positive and a negative makes it a negative. 3 times 9 is 24I. Is -27I. Then we do our -2I. Negative and a negative makes it a positive 10I. Negative and a negative makes it a positive 9 times 2 is 18I squared. Just like with x, we're going to combine like terms, which are these pieces here. So we're going to drop down this -15. -27 and a positive 10 is a -17I. And then this plus 18I squared. Okay, we can simplify this I squared like we did before. We know that I squared is 1. So -15 minus 17I plus 18, and we know I squared is just 1. And then now we just combine like terms, and then this is your final step. So -15 plus 18 is 3, and then you just drop this -17I. Okay. We have kind of time for one more. I'm going to go a little quicker through this one. We're going to look at 17. 4 times 4 is 16. 4 times -3I is -12I. Then we do this 3I to each thing. So 3I times 4 is positive 12I. And 3I times -3I is a -9I squared. If we look here to simplify and combine like terms, -12I and a positive 12I, they go away. So we're left with 16 minus 9. I squared is 1. So 16 minus 9 is 7. So this is a refreshment on imaginary numbers. You guys have a go formative to try some ACT prep.